The map is pinned flat, but it never really lies still. Under a dim operations room lamp, Tonkin looks like a neat chessboard. Rivers like blue threads, roads like faint scratches, French strong points marked with confident little symbols. The kind of map that makes men believe a war can be managed. A ruler slides across the western edge, pauses near a border drawn by ink, not by mountains. And the officer holding it doesn't say Vietnam. He says almost casually, Laos. That single word is the first crack in the story France keeps telling itself. Because in 1951, the rules looked reassuring. When the French stayed behind reinforced positions, they seemed almost untouchable. When Võ Nguyên Giáp tried to push into the Red River Delta, the hard fortified heart around Hanoi, his attacks bled out against wire, concrete, and concentrated firepower. The lesson was brutal and simple. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam could not yet storm the French where the French were strongest. So Giap did what a patient army does when it cannot win a straight fight. He stopped giving them one. On the French side, another truth was also hardening into place. They could strike, but they could not hold. Manpower was thin. Recruitment was a struggle. Every mobile operation was a flash of movement, followed by the same question, spoken softly when the trucks were already turning back. And who stays behind? That is where the war begins to rot. Not at the front, but in the arithmetic. And so, the French reached for a weapon that doesn't appear on the map. Rice. In the paddies southwest of Hanoi, harvest season turns the countryside into an open ledger. Grain isn't just food, it's tempo. It's how long a unit can stay in the field, how many porters can be fed, how many villages can keep pretending this war is someone else's problem. Under General Salan, new commander after Jean de Lattre de Tassigny died on January 11th, 1952, French units and conscripted Vietnamese troops began treating the harvest like a strategic asset to be guarded, purchased, measured, and denied. Sometimes they protected farmers moving sheaves toward silos and blockhouses. Sometimes they paid favorable rates, weighed surpluses, calculated what a family should need to survive until the next season. And sometimes, when there was a risk the Viet Minh would get it first, the policy simplified into smoke. Napalm doesn't care about ideology. It cares about what burns. The moral irony is sharp enough to cut through any propaganda. The French claimed they were saving Vietnam inside the French Union, yet their pressure fell hardest on the very countryside whose loyalty they needed. Every scorched irrigation ditch, every ruined field, turned a political argument into a sensory fact. Hunger has a memory. So, of course, the Viet Minh fought for the rice. Not because it was symbolic, but because it was literal. Grain meant endurance. Endurance meant time. And time was the one resource the Vietnamese leadership could still convert into victory. The French tried to trade time for initiative. In late 1951, buoyed by increased American aid, and determined to exploit the heavy Vietnamese losses of that year, they struck west toward Hoa Binh, a place chosen less for romance than for logistics, a transit point that touched the arteries running north to south. The logic was clean: cut the flow, and the war in the south withers. The move looked like strategy. Giap's reaction looked like weakness. He conceded ground, not because he couldn't see the threat, but because he recognized the trap, a set-piece battle on French terms. He waited, watched the French settle in, then attacked when it suited him, and paid for it in blood. The fighting cost both sides dearly, and when French pressure back in the Delta demanded reinforcements, Hoa Binh was abandoned in early 1952. What had been taken at enormous effort was given back by necessity. A pattern emerged that should have terrified Paris. Victory that could not be retained is just movement. By Bison's October 29th to November 8th, 1952. The French tried another sweeping answer. Operation Lorraine. A large counterinsurgency thrust meant to relieve pressure and disrupt Vietnamese logistics. It looked impressive on paper, arrows sweeping across the delta. It felt like control. Giap refused the script. He did not offer the battle the French wanted. He bled them with hit-and-run attacks and kept his attention where it mattered. The long game, the corridors, the places the map labeled as margins, the Thai highlands, the approaches toward Laos, the thin roads where a war is carried on backs. Then came the moment that seduced the French command into believing they had finally found a winning formula. Nha San, late 1952, a remote garrison fortified into an interlocking system of strongpoints, what the French called a hedgehog. The concept was elegant: build a defended airhead, maintain an air bridge, invite the enemy to concentrate, then destroy him with artillery and air support. The Viet Minh attacked for weeks. The French held. Thousands of Vietnamese fell or were wounded, and when Giap called it off, Nha San remained in French hands. Two armies walked away with two different conclusions. Giap walked away with a warning. If he ever wanted to win a set-piece battle, it would take obsessive preparation, coordination, and the ability to neutralize French firepower, not with courage, but with engineering, logistics, and timing. The French walked away with a promise. This works. And once a headquarters believes it has discovered a universal method, it begins searching for places to apply it, even when the variables are changing. By 1953, pressure squeezed from every direction. In France, public opinion was shifting. Politicians were increasingly willing to talk about negotiation. In Washington, the mood ran in the opposite direction. Dwight Eisenhower entered office convinced that a loss in Indochina would trigger a chain reaction across Asia. The United States wanted aggression, initiative, a plan for victory. When French leadership changed again, Henri Navarre, appointed on Messières, May 27, 1953, he inherited a contradiction dressed up as strategy. Obtain a strong position to negotiate a withdrawal while being financed and pushed by an ally that did not want withdrawal at all. Navarre sat at his desk with the kind of paper every commander learns to fear, a plan written by circumstances, not by choice. And Giap, watching that contradiction harden, made his move. He didn't try to smash the French where they were strongest. He aimed at what the French could not afford to ignore. Upper Laos, April 13th to May 18th, 1953. Vietnamese forces moved west in support of the Pathet Lao, threatening key provinces and, most importantly, threatening the idea that France could keep Indochina stable without spreading itself thin. The military effect mattered, but the psychological effect mattered more. A war that could be concentrated in Tonkin was one kind of problem. A war that spilled into Laos became an entirely different equation. In the operations room, the ruler returns to the map. A pencil circles and recircles the western frontier. Someone mentions Luang Prabang. Someone else mutters about blocking the corridor. The air smells like tobacco and cold coffee. And beneath the professional tone, there is a quiet admission. France does not have enough troops to be strong everywhere, so it must choose one place to appear strong enough. Navarre studies the west of Tonkin, the way a man studies a lock after realizing the building has too many doors. He needs a position big enough for a fortified garrison, big enough for an airfield, positioned to cut the Vietnamese approach into Laos, a place where the hedgehog can be built again, bigger, bolder, decisive. The pencil taps once, then drags across the mountains and stops. A small name in a remote valley, written in letters too modest for what they are about to carry. And the question that should have stopped the room goes unspoken. If Nha San was a lesson, why are they about to repeat it in a place where the lesson may no longer apply? The map stays flat. The decision does not. And somewhere between Tonkin and Laos, a valley waits to become a verdict. The pencil doesn't hesitate this time. It commits. In mid-November 1953, the French High Command is no longer debating whether the war has spilled west. That question has already been answered by Vietnamese movement in Upper Laos months earlier. The debate now is narrower, colder, and far more dangerous. Where do you plant a hedgehog so big that it pins Giap in place? Dien Bien Phu is not chosen because it is famous. It's chosen because it is useful. A valley with an old airstrip and a position that seems on paper to sit astride the approaches into Laos. A place the French believe they can supply by air, fortify quickly, and use as a magnet for a decisive battle. A place that will force the enemy to do what he has avoided doing: concentrate. Wikipedia. There is a moment, quiet, procedural, when the plan stops being an idea and becomes an order. A conference on November 17th, 1953. Subordinate commanders protest. They can see the problem before the first plane takes off. If this is Na San again, it is Na San under worse conditions. Farther, more isolated, harder to supply, harder to rescue. But Navarre rejects the warnings. The operation begins 3 days later. Wikipedia. This is how empires step off cliffs, not with drums, but with signatures. On the morning of November 20th, 1953. The first aircraft roll down the runway, heavy with men and equipment, engines straining at the humid air. The paratroopers sit shoulder to shoulder in the belly of the transport, hands resting on harness straps, boots planted on the metal floor that vibrates like a living thing. Someone checks his reserve chute one more time, not because it changes anything, but because it is something the hands can do when the mind is trying not to picture the drop. At 10 to 35. The valley opens beneath them, a broad, shallow bowl, green and deceptive, ringed by hills like the rim of a trap. The airstrip is there, a thin scar in the middle of nowhere. The jump light shifts, men stand, a brief, sharp silence, then the door and wind and the feeling of being pushed out of the world. Operation Castor lasts November 20th, 1953, and it succeeds in the narrow way military plans love. The French establish the outpost. They seize the valley and begin turning it into a fortified airhead. Wikipedia. The first days feel like proof. A bulldozer lands, an absurd, unglamorous hero, and begins to groom the airstrip. Engineers work with a speed that looks like confidence. Sandbags, trenches, barbed wire, logs dragged into place. The strong points are given women's names, soft syllables pinned onto hard ground. It is easier to say you are reinforcing Beatrice than to say you are digging into a valley with no safe road out. Patrols move into the surrounding hills, testing the edges of the bowl. They come back with muddy boots and partial sightings. Movement on ridgelines, tracks that vanish into forest. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that feels like the main force. Headquarters reads that as encouragement. Because the French plan is not merely to occupy Dien Bien Phu, it is to interdict, to block Vietnamese movement toward Laos, and more importantly, to fix Giap's divisions in a place where French air power and artillery can do what they did at Na San. If www.battlefieldtravels.com. It is a theory of war that depends on a simple assumption. If you build a fort, the enemy will come to smash it. But Giap has already learned to treat assumptions like targets. From his side, the outpost is not just a new French position. It is a question being asked with concrete and barbed wire. Will you attack us on our terms? If he answers too quickly, he gives them exactly what they want. If he ignores it, the French may cut into Laos, threaten Allied forces, and claim initiative, politically, strategically, psychologically. And politics matters here as much as terrain. The United States wants momentum. Paris wants an exit that does not look like defeat. Navarre wants a strong position that can be negotiated from. So Giap does what he has done before, except now the scale is different. He begins to prepare, not in a way that looks dramatic from the air. From above, the jungle remains jungle. The hills remain quiet. The French fly in crates and fuel and confidence, and the valley becomes a machine that lives on aircraft schedules. Air is the road. Air is the bloodstream. Every landing proves the concept again. The fortress can be fed. The fortress can grow. And with every landing, the bet becomes harder to reverse. Because an airhead is not just a tactical choice. It's an addiction. Once you build your logistics around an airstrip, you start treating that airstrip like destiny. The deferred question returns, sharper now. What happens when air is your only road, and the enemy begins treating the sky like a battlefield? The Viet Minh answer does not arrive as a speech or a flag. It arrives as labor. Somewhere beyond the valley, men and women lean into bamboo poles. Loads swing from their shoulders, rice, ammunition, tools. Parts that don't look like weapons until they are assembled into something that changes the geometry of power. Feet slip on wet earth. Hands catch themselves on roots. A whispered warning passes back along the line. Aircraft overhead. Everyone freezes beneath the canopy. The jungle swallows movement the way water swallows stones. This is not romantic. It is not cinematic. It is simply what it takes to move weight through mountains when you do not control roads. And weight is the whole point. The French have built their confidence on the idea that remote valleys are safe from heavy Vietnamese firepower, that the terrain is too hard, the distance too great, the guns too heavy. That belief sits inside the Hedgehog model like a hidden pillar. If it holds, the fortress holds. If it breaks, back in the valley, the routine becomes a kind of trance. Planes come in, planes go out. Paratroopers become garrison troops. The airstrip becomes a clock. The officers begin to talk about drawing Giap in, the way a fisherman talks about a fish that is already imagined on the line. They name hills, measure arcs of fire, plot overlapping fields, and, most importantly, believe that the enemy has only two options: attack and lose, or retreat and concede. This is where the tragedy of strategic certainty sets in. It edits reality to fit the plan. Giap, however, is not choosing between the two options the French have prepared. He is creating a third, wait, and reshape the terms of the battle. By late 1953 into early 1954, the hills around Dien Bien Phu begin to change without changing. The French see jungle and think concealment. Giap sees jungle and thinks cover for construction. A hillside that looks empty by day becomes, by night, a place where earth is moved and positions are dug, slowly, carefully, in ways designed to survive air attack. Paths multiply like veins. Emplacements appear where the French do not expect them. And the French inside the bowl still feel the comfort of their own framework. The outpost exists. Therefore, it is working. A veteran later recalls the feeling. By December, they knew it was doomed. But in the moment, doom rarely announces itself. It arrives as small frictions, landings that become harder, aircraft that take more fire, a growing sense that the hills are watching. Le monde.far. And yet the base keeps being reinforced. The hedgehog keeps growing spines. Because turning back would mean admitting the model is not universal. It would mean admitting Nassan was not a formula, only a circumstance. It would mean admitting that the war is not a math problem you can solve with enough tonnage delivered by air. So, the French double down on the very thing Giap is trying to weaponize against them: concentration. He wants them tied to the valley. He wants their prestige tied to it. He wants their logistics tied to it. He wants their political story tied to it. So that when the valley becomes a siege, leaving will feel impossible. And now the second deferred question becomes unavoidable. If the French built Dien Bien Phu to force at a set-piece battle, what if Giap accepts the set-piece battle, only after he has built the set? Inside a bunker, a radio crackles. A staff officer lifts the handset, listens, writes a note, and passes it along without expression. On paper, it is a normal report. Increased enemy activity in the hills. On the ground, it means something else. The outpost is no longer an object placed on a map. It is a target being measured. Some nights, the valley feels too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes men invent noise. A sentry shifts his weight and hears the small betrayals of his own body. Breath in cold air, boots on packed dirt. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire, the jungle holds a patience that doesn't need floodlights. The French still believe the enemy must come up the valley floor into their guns. Giap is making sure the real pressure comes from the sides, from above, from angles the French can't simply invite into their preferred geometry. This is the shattering point of Part 2. The war stops being about maneuver and becomes about enclosure. The fortress, built to attract the enemy, begins to attract something else, a ring. And as the weeks pass, the airstrip, the fortress's heart, starts to look less like a lifeline and more like a single point of failure painted onto the valley floor. The last image before the storm is not an explosion. It is a calculation. A French pilot glances at the valley on approach and thinks in distances. Runway length, glide path, wind. A Viet Minh gun crew in the hills thinks in angles. Elevation, traverse, range. Two kinds of mathematics meeting in the same air. The battle that France wanted is coming, but not the way France imagined, and on the eve of that first sustained blow, when the hills finally speak with more than footsteps, Dien Bien Phu reveals what it has really been all along. Not a trap for Giap, but a commitment France can no longer afford to break. Because once the first serious barrage begins, the question will no longer be, is the Hedgehog model correct? It will be far simpler. Can the airstrip survive long enough to keep the fortress? The first sustained barrage doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like correction. On March 13th, 1944, the hills around Dien Bien Phu finally speak in a language the French model never truly accounted for. Sustained, accurate fire from above. In the valley, the Hedgehog is still there. Strong points, trenches, wire, a staff that knows the theory by heart. But theory depends on one fragile assumption, that the airstrip remains a road. The runway takes its first deep wounds quickly. A crater is not just a hole in dirt. It's a question mark stamped into the entire plan. Aircraft still come, but now they come lower, faster, and with that tight, clipped fear that pilots don't say out loud. When the strip becomes unreliable, the air bridge turns into a gamble, and the gamble turns into a schedule written by weather, smoke, and angle of fire. The garrison adapts the way trap systems always do. It improvises. Supplies drop by parachute. Radios crackle with requests that sound increasingly like prayers. More ammunition, more wire, more medical stores, more time. But time is the one thing no transport can deliver, and Giap's siege is built to spend French time like currency. What makes Dien Bien Phu collapse is not a single heroic moment, but the slow subtraction of options. A strong point that falls is more than ground lost. It's an artillery observation point gained. A trench that creeps closer is more than mud moved. It's a shortening fuse. The French fight hard, but the geometry is wrong. They are inside a bowl while the enemy rewrites the rim. And the airstrip, once the fortress's heartbeat, becomes a scar. When aircraft cannot land, everything becomes heavier. Every crate must drift down where the wind allows. Every parachute can be shredded by fire. Every missed drop becomes a missing hour of resistance. The Hedgehog still has spines, but now it is starving in plain sight. Inside command bunkers, officers keep drawing lines on maps that no longer match the ground. Outside, a young sentry learns the new rhythm of the valley. Not day and night, but barrage and pause, digging and listening. The brief silence that always feels like it's hiding something worse. Giap's real victory is that he makes the French fortress behave like a besieged city, pinned, predictable, and politically impossible to abandon. By early May, the end is no longer debated. It is measured. Positions shrink. Communications falter. The valley that was meant to be a magnet for a decisive French triumph becomes a stage for a decisive French exhaustion. And, on the about May 7th, 1954, yes, Dien Bien Phu stops being a plan and becomes a fact. The garrison is overrun, the battle is lost, and France's war in Indochina is no longer sustainable in the old language of empire. The echo travels faster than any aircraft ever did. In Paris, the defeat hardens arguments that had been growing for years. In Washington, it deepens the obsession with not losing the region. In Southeast Asia, it redraws the future. Geneva, negotiation, partition, and the quiet, chilling realization that the end of one war can be the blueprint for the next. And somewhere, back in the countryside, where rice once decided seasons, people look at fields and wonder what victory even means when the harvest has already been burned, by policy, by necessity, by fear. Dien Bien Phu is remembered as a battle, but the colder truth is that it was also a demonstration. When a war becomes an argument about control, the side that can force the other to commit, then remove their ability to change their mind, doesn't need to win every firefight. It only needs to close the door, and make the enemy discover, too late, that the key they trusted was never theirs.